My name is John Henshaw, and the name of my talk is Energy and the Color of Blood. The year is 1840. A young German by the name of Julius Robert Mayer has taken work as a ship's doctor. On his first voyage to the Dutch East Indies, the young doctor complains of being lonely, bored, and hungry. But when his ship arrives in port, the doctor's in for a surprise. He's examining a patient, and when he draws the patient's blood, what he sees shocks and amazes him. Mayer is on the verge of discovering one of the most important concepts in all of science. This is a story about the discovery of the concept of energy. Energy is a concept that can be used to explain practically anything in our universe. All kinds of natural things like the behavior of plants and animals, and mountains, and the weather, and planets spinning through space. But also man-made items such as cars and houses, airplanes, and wind turbines. All of these can be explained by the concept of energy. Let's look at just a few examples of how energy is used in our everyday lives. I'm going to describe these, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why energy is such a difficult and abstract concept, and then I'm going to return to the story of Julius Robert Mayer. In our diets, we use food calories to describe the energy content of the food that we take in on a daily basis. There's much more to diet and to nutrition than just calories in equals calories out. But when it comes to gaining or losing weight, the laws of energy cannot be denied. Same thing is true of the cars that we drive, just different units. Energy goes into our cars in the form of gasoline most of the time, and we measure our car's efficiency in terms of how far it can go per unit of energy, per unit of gasoline. The same thing is true with electricity, only once again, we use different units. As this electrical meter shows, we measure the electricity that we utilize in our houses in terms of kilowatt hours. When we want to make an apples-to-apples comparison between two different types of the same appliance, for example, a refrigerator or a microwave oven, we use units of energy, as in this energy rating chart. We can also use the concept of energy to compare one technology to another, as in wind power versus solar energy, to evaluate the sustainability of a technology, or even to understand changes to our planet's climate and the causes for those changes. So energy is a very, very important concept, but at the same time, it's an abstract and difficult to understand concept, and let's look at a few reasons why that is. Objects can have energy for very many different reasons. For example, objects have energy simply based on where they are located. For example, this baseball sitting up high on a shelf. That same baseball has a different form of energy when it is thrown hard by a major league pitcher, for example, as in this photo. Objects also contain energy bound up in the atoms and the molecules of which they are made up. For example, molecules of gasoline or the molecules of chocolate in a chocolate cupcake. And objects as well contain energy simply based on what temperature they are at, as in this pot of boiling water. So all of these different examples are different forms of energy. Energy due to position, energy due to velocity, energy due to chemical bonds, energy due to temperature. All of these seemingly unrelated concepts all fall under the broad umbrella of energy and can all be used to explain their behavior. So energy is at once a very, very important concept and a very abstract concept. So where did this idea come from? Let's see if we can find our way back to the story of the young doctor sailing to the Dutch East Indies. The story of the discovery of energy begins with Sir Isaac Newton, perhaps the greatest scientist who ever lived. Newton had no idea about energy. 180 years after Newton's passing, however, the great Albert Einstein was able to write down the most famous scientific formula of all time, E equals mc squared, in which he posited the equivalence between energy and matter. In between Newton and Einstein, the concept of energy was born, but not all at once. A veritable who's who of the most famous scientists of all time working in fits and starts and in a most circuitous path, eventually came up with the modern concept of energy. What sort of things were these folks working on? Well, for example, they were working on water wheels and steam engines and perpetual motion and magnetism. So much great science and so many great stories. We could, for example, tell the story of the brilliant Sadi Carnot, who in his 20s set down a treatise about the performance limits of steam engines that was so important that it is still taught to scientists and engineers today, nearly 200 years later, because it is just as valid for the performance of a modern jet airplane engine as it was to the primitive steam engines in the 1800s. Carnot's career was cut short just a few years later when he died in the cholera epidemic at the age of 32. We might also talk about the brilliant Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, whose experiments into the chemistry of life enabled him to conclude that respiration is just a slow form of combustion. Lavoisier, at the height of his scientific powers, was beheaded by the leaders of the French Revolution, after which a colleague remarked, "It took but a moment to make this head fall. 100 years might not be sufficient to create another one like it." Or Joseph Fourier, whose investigations into the fundamental nature of heat led him to develop mathematical techniques that are so powerful that they are found inside the software of nearly every electronic gadget in our wallets and purses today. Fourier was also the first scientist to quantify what is now known as the global greenhouse effect. All of these stories, as compelling as they may be, lead me back inexorably to the story with which I began my talk today, that of Julius Robert Mayer and the color of blood. Julius Robert Mayer was raised in the town of Heilbronn, Germany, a town whose economy depended upon the water wheels that were powered by the water flowing down the Neckar River. As a young boy, Mayer was fascinated with how water wheels operate. So here's a water wheel. The way they work is that water comes in the top, and that causes the wheel to spin around. That same water then passes out the bottom. If you're clever enough, you can harness the power inside the water wheel and use it to do useful work, for example, grinding flour. Mayer's brilliant idea as a 10-year-old boy was to take some of the water that came out the bottom of the water wheel and, using part of the power of the water wheel, pump that water back up to the top and in through the water wheel again. The idea was that in doing so, he would get more power out of the water wheel for the same amount of water. Mayer was a clever lad. He would have made a great engineer, and he built several ingenious models, but he could never quite get them to work the way he thought they should. And he ended up by concluding that what he was trying to do was impossible. And today we would come to the same conclusion. Today we would say that what Mayer was trying to invent was a perpetual motion machine, which we now know to be not possible. But Mayer was left with a lifelong obsession with systems like water wheels and how the various inputs and outputs relate to each other. Later, Mayer attended medical school, where he became interested in a different kind of system, the human body. But he never stopped comparing the two. To Mayer, a human body and a water wheel were similar in that they both had inputs and outputs, and they had these inputs and outputs somehow had to add up. There had to be some sort of a rule that governed the way all these things worked. When he was in medical school in Germany, Mayer learned well that when blood leaves the lungs, it has a bright red color. That blood passes through the body, and when it returns to the lungs again, the color has changed from a bright red to a deep maroon. At least that's how things worked back in Germany. When Mayer got to the tropics and was examining his patient, when he drew the patient's blood, he realized that the patient's blood was changing color very little as it passed through the body. Blood left the lungs as bright red, but when it returned to the lungs, the color had not changed to maroon. It was still almost the same bright red that it had been when it had left the lungs. Another sailor who'd spent a lot of time in the tropics told Mayer, it's the way things always are here. The blood always looks like that. Nobody had ever thought twice about it until Mayer came along. Mayer instantly knew, he instantly sensed that he was onto a fundamental scientific principle. It took a genius like Mayer to compare the operation of a water wheel to the color of blood flowing through a human body. In today's terms, we would say that the water that's entering a water wheel contains a lot of energy. By the time that same water has passed through the water wheel and out the bottom, it contains a lot less energy. The difference in energy is what we utilized, for example, to grind flour. The same thing happens in the human body. Bright red blood leaves the lungs, full of energy. As that blood passes through the body, it gives up its energy little by little in order to keep our bodies functioning, in order to keep our organs working, in order to keep our muscles working and our nerves firing, and very importantly, in order to keep our bodies warm. And that's the big difference between Germany and the tropics. In the tropics, things are always warm. And the blood doesn't have to work as hard. It doesn't have to give up as much energy to keep the body warm because it's already warm. And that's why the blood doesn't change color so much. This was Mayer's big revelation when he examined his patient back in 1840. Mayer returned to Germany, and he wrote several papers about this subject. Unfortunately, he was not a member of the established scientific community, and he lacked basic scientific training. As such, his papers were ignored. They were also filled with some basic science and math errors. Mayer's basic ideas, his principles were correct, but the details of his papers were found to be wanting. And thus his work was basically ignored for quite some time. Other Europeans were working on the same subject at the same time, in particular, the brilliant English experimentalist James Prescott Joule. This is a drawing of Joule's most famous experiment. The way this worked is that the weight at right was allowed to drop, which pulled on the cable, which caused the shaft at the center to turn, which caused this paddle wheel to spin around inside a bucket of water. The agitation of the water caused the temperature of the water to go up ever so slightly, which was measured with the thermometer showed inside the bucket there. Joule was a master experimentalist and was extremely good at measuring small changes in temperature. He repeated his experiment over and over and over again, and eventually concluded that there was a constant that related the work of the falling weight to the change in temperature of the water. And the number he came up with is very close to the number that we use today, nearly 200 years later. So Joule had essentially experimentally confirmed the ideas that Mayer had developed earlier and had set down in his not very well-written papers. When Mayer, another thing to keep in mind is that Joule's experiment is eerily reminiscent of the water wheels of Mayer's youth. In a water wheel, the motion of the wheel is used to do work. In Joule's experiment, he simply turns it around and he allows the falling weight to do work on the water. When Mayer realized that Joule was getting credit for the work that he had done, he became despondent. He had any number of tragedies in his own personal life as well. For example, 4 of Mayer's 7 children died very young. Several decades passed, and Mayer eventually received the credit for which he was due for the concept of energy. So Julius Robert Mayer's story reminds me a little bit about the concept of energy itself. Energy is this difficult, abstract, hard to understand concept, just like Mayer's life was. But energy is, at the same time, such an important concept and oh so useful. Thank you very much.